Hello and welcome to week 1 of remote learning. Mr. Hauger here, and I hope you're all doing really well. You probably already watched the introduction video, so let's jump right in to who was responsible for the start of the Cold War. This is going to be part of our summary recap after my students taught the class about the things I need you to know and want you to go away with after we depart this topic and move on to the Vietnam War. So this is a resource from Reading Like a Historian from the Stanford Historical Education Group, that's Shegg. And so they're responsible for creating this document, and all credit goes to them. But for educational purposes, we're about to get going and discuss a few different documents. So this is like a document-based question. I'm going to walk you through these 4 docs and give you some guidance and some instruction. And afterwards, there are guiding questions at the end for you to answer that are due Friday at midnight. And you can email those to haugerd@luhsd.net. Let's get going. So document A is a timeline, and we have to consider the years here. 1945 to 1955 is the early start to this Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. We talked and had presentations in our class about the Yalta Conference, which was the division of Berlin and the disagreement over how the world should work after World War II and who should be in power and in control. And it only allowed certain powers to decide what would happen to the rest of the world. That was still when the World War II was on, to determine what would happen to Germany at the end of it. Also had implications for Poland and Eastern Europe. On August 6th the same year, we get towards the end of the war in Japan with the first atomic bomb. Russia entered the war against Japan on August 8th as well. And 6 days later, after the second bomb, Japan surrenders, ending World War II before the threatening of a third bomb by the United States. In 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech. And that was a big statement about the containment of communism and how the United States must protect the ideals and freedoms that it stands for. Truman announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and that was in the United States, the doctrine of containing communism and protecting capitalism and business interests of the United States abroad. The Marshall Plan then followed up, and we had presentations there as well that financed the rebuilding of Europe in many places, and the hope that the United States would remain the friendly ideology of the world and prevent communism from taking over. In 1948, the communists take over in Czechoslovakia, and the Berlin blockade begins in June. By July, the NATO treaty was ratified for many unified Western countries to defend all of its fellow country members in case there was an attack, which again, it reminds us of the alliances that were part of the main reasons of World War I and World War II. It is the beefing up and securitizing of countries and protections around the world. The Berlin blockade lasted until May 12th, my birthday, 1949. I feel like my birthday's come up like 8 times in the past 4 weeks. If anyone's keeping track, you don't need to do. In September, Mao Zedong takes communist control of China in 49. The Soviets explode their first atomic bomb, changing the game in 49. And then in 1955, the Warsaw Pact saw a lot of Eastern European nations unified. I'll give you a minute to think about those events. Yep, got my water bottle here at home as well. So those timelines show you that over 10 years, there was a gradual escalation in conflict and power. And there was definitely a straw grab to see who can get as many alliances as possible and centralize power. And you could tell that all countries were concerned about the future loss of life or loss of power after so many nations lost people. Russia losing 24 million people in World War II, the United States 440,000, but spending billions and billions and then amounting to trillions of dollars in resources. Here's document A. This is that Iron Curtain speech, and it is really important to know the primary words that were used by these countries so that we don't take arguments out of context. And even though words don't always give us a direct idea of everything that was said and what the intentions were and what the truth and transparencies were, it does give us a real concrete understanding of the messages that were directly sent. So this is the speech that is going to be cited many different times about how the Western world, and we even count Western Europe here, because Winston Churchill's going to deliver this speech, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It is my duty, however, to place before you certain facts about the present position in Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Beyond that line, like all the capitalists of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some case increasing measure of control from Moscow. In a great number of countries, far from the Russian frontiers, communist fifth columns are established and work in complete unity and absolute obedience to the directions they receive from the communist center. I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. What they desire is the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. But we have to consider here today, while time remains, is the permanent prevention of war and the establishment of conditions of freedom and democracy as rapidly as possible in all countries. That's an excerpt from Winston Churchill's speech in March, which he made in Missouri on a visit to the United States. So some things that I would point out to you as your teacher, even though I can't see you and I can't walk around the class to see who's on their phones and who's snacking, here's some of the things that I feel are significant. Clearly, Churchill believes that there's a range of countries in Central and Eastern Europe who are subject to increasing control from Moscow. They're concerned about that sphere of influence, which is something we talked about a few weeks back. In these countries, even though it's far from the Russian boundary, communism is spreading, and it's requiring absolute obedience. It's taking all directions over these countries. And he doesn't think, Churchill speaking, doesn't think that Soviet Russia wants war, but they do want the benefit of what war brings and the expansion of their power and their influence. So if that's the case, then he's calling for democracy to spread as rapidly as possible. But note that that's exactly what the Novikov telegram was scared of as far as the United States control, is that we're stating in this letter, we being the Western world, that Russia's trying to increase their sphere of influence, control and command economies around the world and gain power. In return, our response says we should establish conditions of freedom everywhere so that our system, democracy, can rise as rapidly as possible. But note that that's exactly the same sentiment that the USSR was afraid of, that we were trying to spread capitalism and crush communism all over. And it seems that with these words that both sides are committed to their doctrines and spreading them without consideration of how that's going to be received from the United States. Now I'm going to direct you, and I would do this as a student. I would come down here and pre-read the questions. So I'm going to let you pre-read the questions for the next document. I'll have you do those first two when you go back. We're going to look at that Soviet ambassador telegram from Nicholas Novikov next. Look at these first three questions, and then we're going to go back and read that. Okay. So when we sat in a circle in class, we read the Novikov telegram and we had it on the day that we did that forum or the Socratic seminar. Here, Soviet ambassador telegram, this is modified. It's a bit abridged, meaning it's been shortened. I'm going to turn on my backup camera here in case we didn't record those first two documents, and you can read those if those didn't come through. Here's document C. This is the Soviet ambassador telegram. The foreign policy of the United States, which reflects the imperialist tendencies of American monopolistic capital, is characterized in the post-war period by a striving for world supremacy. So they're specifically, the Soviet Union is specifically concerned or states their concern with our monopoly over money, the post-war period, and wanting to be the dominant power, which if you look back at Churchill's statement, is really what he was concerned about as well. It's stated in the Truman Doctrine, and it's also stated in the Iron Curtain speech. So both of those documents talk about the primary objective of our foreign policy, to establish freedom without coercion. But they're also concerned in the USSR that we might be trying to be the supreme power of the world. This is the real meaning of the many statements by President Truman and other representatives of American ruling circles, that the United States has the right to lead the world. All the forces of American diplomacy, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, industry, and science, are enlisted in the service of this foreign policy. For this purpose, broad plans for expansion have been developed and are being implemented through diplomacy and the establishment of a system of naval and air bases stretching far beyond the boundaries of the United States, through the arms race and through the creation of ever newer types of weapons. So, at least stated here, the USSR is also concerned about how fast arms are advancing and the more damaging new types of weapons. So, in statements, the positioning seemed to be very similar. He continues, the Soviet ambassador. During the Second World War, American leaders calculated that the U.S., if it could avoid direct participation in the war, would enter it at the last minute when it would completely ensure its interest. That's an accusation saying that if the United States had not come into the war, that we only did it for the glory. We came in when the war was basically already won, that the USSR had done the heavy lifting. We came in when it was a sure thing that would be victory, and then our interest would be advanced because we would get some of the spoils of war. Go back and read the Truman Doctrine, too, after this. I'm reading these out of order because I think they are better understood in this order, but I want you to see how similar they are, but how also there's a difference in perspective here for the first time, where it's basically saying the U.S. came in when the war was going to be easily won. In this regard, it was thought that the main competitors of the United States would be crushed or greatly weakened in the war, and the United States, by virtue of the circumstance, would assume the role of the most powerful factor in resolving the fundamental questions of the post-war world. So I think you got a pretty good idea of how we're going to answer those questions here. Who was he? He was the ambassador, and you can look at the date, because I want you to get familiar with finding details and retrieving those details and putting them into a place to answer questions without being spoon-fed. Again, go back and read that section about how he describes our country. What evidence does he have to support that description? We just talked about that. And what does he claim the U.S. planned during the Second World War? Reread it one more time. Think about what I said and conceptualize your opinion of what he's trying to paint here. And we're going to close with the Henry Wallace letter, and I'm going to let you pre-read these last three questions for this final document that we're about to get into. So take 30 seconds and take a look here. All right. So let's dive into document D. It's one of the shorter documents. So we just read in document C, a Russian ambassador and his perception of what happened. Now we're going to get the equivalent, which is Henry Wallace, who is the Secretary of Commerce and former Vice President. And he's writing to President Truman, July 23rd, 1946. Context for me as a teacher wants to go back and tell you that we are still very early in this Cold War period. In fact, before we even start financing the rebuilding and the alliances that we're going to fund across Europe. So very early, but here's what the VP is talking to the president in a letter. Here's what he says. And again, we did explore this in our Socratic seminar, but this is one of those foundational U.S. documents that really informed people's opinions during this time who were in power. I've been increasingly disturbed about the trend of international affairs since the end of the war. What do our actions look like to other nations? I mean, actions like the bikini test of the atomic bomb, which isn't as fun as it sounds, and continued production of bombs, the plan to arm Latin America with our weapons, and the effort to secure air bases and spread over half the globe. I cannot but feel these actions must look to the rest of the world like we're paying lip service to peace, I mean just talking about peace at the conference table. These facts really make it look like either one, that we're preparing to win a war which we think is going to happen, or two, that we are trying to build up a predominance of force to intimidate the rest of mankind. Our interest in establishing democracy in Eastern Europe, where democracy by and large has never existed, seems to the Soviets an attempt to reestablish the encirclement of unfriendly neighbors, which might serve as a springboard of still another effort to destroy them. Meaning that our Secretary of Commerce and VP thinks that it looks like threatening business that we're taking on here, and they don't like the Soviets don't like the way it's perceived. So I want you to answer those 3 questions. Feel free to pause and look back at the resources if you need them. I want you to also, if you can't find it, you can find this document on Sheg.Stanford.edu. And then ask yourself, who was primarily responsible? And with this second hypothesis, I need you to give me some evidence from one of the 4 documents if you want full points. Any evidence that you think supports your claim. And if you'd like up to 5 points of extra credit, and again, this is assuming that all these will be graded. If they are not graded, then I would like you to complete this just to advance your skill and understanding of the topic. For up to 5 points, make a slide for each timeline item, up to 5 items in the timeline in document A. Summarize what happened in each in your own words, not copied and pasted. And that is going to put a wrap on week 1. When we return for week 2, I'll give you a little glimpse of what's happening next. When we come back for week 2, we'll be looking at Guatemala. And the reason we're going to do that again is because I want you to know the story and how the implications of, again, our actions, just like Henry Wallace talked about there, how they were perceived in foreign countries and how they affected the course of American and world history. Well, this is Mr. Hauger, and I thank you so much for tuning in to this document that was prepared by Sheg and analyzed by me. I hope you are happy and healthy and safe and enjoying your time with your family and friends. And we will see you real soon on the next week episode. Go ahead and send that document along, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.